And Dr. Parker, I'd like to give a brief introduction again to start us off from scratch. So we just had the privilege of having our first hacked talk, which shows the sensitivity of this topic. And we've now rejoined the meeting. I'm Bob Della Valle. I'm a professor of dermatology at the University of Colorado and director of the local Colorado Cochrane affiliate. And I'm also an editor for Cochrane Skin and on the Cochrane Council. And it gives me tremendous pleasure today to introduce a current mentee of mine and student at our medical school, Lucas Sloan, who will in turn introduce my second mentee of my academic career, Dr. Eva Parker, who was a medical student and worked with me as a medical student, got into dermatology at the university, at Northwestern University, and is now an academic dermatologist at Vanderbilt. So proud of you, Eva, talking about and working on these important topics. And I'll pass it over to Lucas Sloan, a member of our next generation of dermatology leaders, hopefully. Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Del Valle. I will go ahead and give a shortened version of my intro from last time, save some time. But as Dr. Del Valle said, I am a second-year medical student at the University of Colorado currently, and also a mentee of Dr. Parker, who was introduced to me by Dr. Del Valle, my current mentor. And I reached out to Dr. Del Valle about the intersection of climate change and dermatological health. And that's how I got in touch with Dr. Parker. She has quite an impressive resume. She graduated from the University of Denver with a BS in environmental science, where she developed an interest in how the environment and changing climate can affect health. She got her MD at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and did her residency at Northwestern University. After a successful career in private practice, she moved back to her hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, where she joined Vanderbilt University Medical Center as assistant professor of dermatology, where she still resides. Her current academic and research interests include health effects secondary to climate change, HIV dermatosis, tropical skin disease, and global health. She also provides volunteer telehealth services to immigrants, refugees, and underserved populations in Nashville, Tennessee. She is the editorial board member of the Journal of Climate Change and Health, a member of the International Society of Dermatology's Committee on Climate Change, an advocate member of the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and a member of the Cochrane Climate Health Working Group. She serves on the Mayor of Nashville Sustainability Advisory Committee and is co-founder of the Environmental Sustainability Working Group at Vanderbilt. And I've only mentioned a portion of everything that she does currently and has accomplished so far in the past. The list goes on and on. So if you haven't noticed already, she's an extremely hard worker, a passionate physician, and importantly, an advocate for education on the health impacts of climate change. And with that, I will let Dr. Parker take it away, hopefully without interruption this time.
Thank you so much. As I said before, this is such a treat to be co-introduced by my former mentor and my current mentee, who I am co-mentoring with my former mentor. So it's a really special way to see that relationship come full circle. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm really excited to talk about my most favorite topic, which is climate change and dermatology. So I'm going to try to share my slides again. Okay, can everybody see that and hear me? Great. So I'm going to talk about climate change, dermatology, and vulnerable populations. This will be a brief overview of climate science, a broad view of the impacts of climate change on health and health systems, and a few detailed dermatology examples, a deep dive on vulnerable populations, and an examination of scientific evidence and what I think our future research priorities should be. So since the turn of the 20th century, our consumption of everything from water to energy to plastics has increased. But the most egregious problem is the dramatic increase in global combustion of fossil fuels. And this has been mostly since the 1950s. As a consequence of human activity and the burning of fossil fuels, the concentration of greenhouse gases, which absorb and emit infrared and heat, has dramatically increased in our atmosphere. And in this chart mapping the last 800,000 years, we see an exponential increase in CO2 in the last century. While the problems are complex, the basic progression of their relationship is not. Human action has significantly increased greenhouse gas emissions, which has warmed the planet and thus changed our climate. We are now experiencing a shift to more hot weather and have experienced the hottest years ever on record in the last decade. This is especially true in the Arctic, where temperatures are increasing much faster. Global warming is having a significant impact on our oceans and their role in stabilizing climate. Rising water temperatures expand the volume of the oceans and melt polar ice, both of which accelerate sea level rise. Warm ocean water has greater rates of evaporation, increasing the frequency and intensity of severe storms. And due to extreme heat, historically arid areas have become increasingly drought prone and more prone to wildfires. On the next few slides, I want to discuss 2 points which are tangentially related to climate change. First, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were created as refrigerants and were used in aerosols in manufacturing for many decades. They are long-lived in the atmosphere and are a double environmental hit because they not only act as potent greenhouse gases, but they also destroy the stratospheric ozone layer, resulting in large ozone holes. Since the ozone layer is like Earth's broad-brimmed hat, the destruction of the ozone layers has dramatically increased UVB radiation reaching the Earth's surface. And due to complex feedback mechanisms, stratospheric ozone depletion is altering climate. In turn, climate change may delay stratospheric ozone recovery by as much as 30 years, creating a vicious cycle. Air pollution is another important topic that I want to address, and that's because climate change and air pollution have the same root cause: burning fossil fuels. Additionally, the contribution to air pollution from natural sources such as dust and wildfires is further amplified by heat and drought resulting from climate change. It's important to note that the vast majority of the world is already breathing unhealthy levels of air pollution, and air pollution is implicated in at least 7 million deaths annually worldwide. Air pollution is a heterogeneous mix of gases and particles. The major components of air pollution from burning fossil fuels are similar to that generated by wildfires. Ground level ozone is considered a secondary pollutant and is the major component of photochemical smog. It's produced when oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds from the burning of fossil fuels react with UV light and heat, both of which have increased due to human-induced environmental impacts. Moreover, heat can really contribute to stagnation, allowing pollution to remain in place for extended periods. Since the 1970s, annual stagnant days have increased in the majority of US cities. And in particular, warm, sunny regions such as Colorado are at risk for ozone pollution for most of the year. In addition, Denver's geography specifically is such that it is also frequently afflicted with temperature inversions in the winter that exacerbate the trapping of pollutants. Particulate matter is the major component of both anthropogenic air pollution and wildfire smoke. It is classified based on size, and this diagram provides some perspective of how small these particles are. There's growing concern also over ultrafine particles, which are not depicted here, but they measure less than 0.1 micrometers and are routinely not regulated worldwide. Particulate matter is also quite sticky and is often coated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals. PM is pretty nasty stuff. It penetrates deeply into the lungs and enters the systemic circulation via endothelial tight junctions. Particulate matter crosses the blood-brain barrier and promotes both thrombosis and atherosclerosis. In addition to exacerbating lung disease like asthma and COPD, it's also one of the leading causes of pneumonia in children. And air pollution is also classified as a lung carcinogen and is linked with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, poor maternal fetal outcomes, and dementia. So what is the impact of all of this? Well, first and foremost is harm to public health, creating really a global health crisis or emergency, which includes exacerbation of health disparities, both locally and globally. Additionally, there are enormous economic repercussions, national security considerations, failure of infrastructure, food insecurity, mass migrations, poverty, and armed conflicts, and intergenerational inequities such that future generations will be disproportionately affected by climate change. There is a funnel effect on health impacts resulting from the pressures applied by climate change, such that our overconsumption results in ecological harm, which drives and creates the hazards that are the proximate causes that harm human health. Politics and poverty can further amplify these effects. And the result is that climate change is a threat multiplier for health, equity, and health systems. Consequently, health is being affected now, and we are all at risk. The interactions are complex and multifactorial, and the risk will be greater if the temperature rises above 2 degrees Celsius. These health harms carry an enormous economic burden on the order of $1 trillion annually spent in the US alone. This diagram illustrates the complex web of factors that ultimately contribute to the health effects resulting from climate change. Basically, every organ system is impacted, as you can see from the long list here, and that includes cutaneous disease, of which there are many. The influence of climate change on individual skin disease is also complex and multifactorial because skin is our largest organ and our primary interface with our environment. It also uniquely displays cutaneous manifestations of systemic disease, which are duly impacted by climate impacts. I wish I had time to discuss all of these today because they're really quite interesting, but we don't have that luxury. So I'd like to present 2 common skin diseases which have a prominent influence from environmental factors, which contributes to their physiology. And I'd like to use these as case studies to examine the complex interplay of multiple environmental impacts on specific dermatologic disease. So we'll look at skin cancer first. Skin cancer represents the most common cancer in humans, and we are seeing rising rates worldwide, both in melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancers. Climate change and environmental impacts are implicated as contributory factors to this increased incidence. And despite current restrictions on CFCs imposed by the Montreal Protocol, ongoing depletion of stratospheric ozone continues to cause increased UVB radiation at Earth's surface. UVB is the most damaging to cells because DNA's aromatic rings act as UVB chromophores, absorbing the light and resulting in photoproducts such as pyrimidine dimers, which trigger mutagenesis and ultimately carcinogenesis. Because of the long latency between UV exposure and the development of cutaneous malignancy, the diagram here shows that skin cancer rates due to the increased UVR from stratospheric ozone depletion is expected to continue to rise for decades to come. Global warming itself may also play a role. Heat influences human behavior, resulting in the donning of fewer clothes with more exposed skin. And heat prompts increased time spent outdoors, therefore increasing UV exposure. But beyond behavior itself, animal models have long demonstrated that UV light is more efficient at inducing cutaneous carcinogenesis at higher temperatures. Air pollution is also linked with cutaneous carcinogenesis via induction of reactive oxygen species and activation of the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, triggering DNA damage, melanogenesis, and inflammation. When pollution and UV radiation combine, they actually have a synergistic effect on enhancing these carcinogenic pathways. Another disease with multifactorial influences from climate change is atopic dermatitis. There is significant correlation between higher daily summer temperatures and bad air quality as measured by ground level ozone concentrations. And Denver is ranked as having the 4th worst air pollution in the nation. Air pollution is implicated as causative for more than 100,000 fatalities a year just in the United States. Pollution generated by the burning of fossil fuels and wildfires contributes numerous noxious pollutants. Those of major concern for the skin include polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are found in and on particulate matter, gases such as ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. And with lipophilic properties and the ability to both penetrate the epidermis directly and pass transdermally by way of follicular and eccrine ostia, as well as enter the skin by indirect dermal uptake via the systemic circulation, these pollutants are able to exert numerous deleterious effects on the skin. Air pollution produces free radicals and reactive oxygen species, and bind and activate the aryl hydrocarbon receptors we discussed with skin cancer, but also the pregnane X receptor, triggering molecular cascades that result in depletion of antioxidant activity, lipid peroxidation, inflammatory cytokine production, downregulation of filaggrin, skin barrier defects, increased transepidermal water loss, and alteration of the skin's microbiome, leading to increased colonization with pathogens. A growing body of evidence has emerged supporting that exposure to air pollution increases both the incidence and severity of atopic dermatitis. Interestingly, maternal exposure to air pollution from exhaust during the prenatal period can increase the risk of atopic dermatitis in infants, in part due to induction of epigenetic modifications in utero that polarize the immune response towards a Th2 phenotype, which is characteristic of atopy. Research this year from Kim and colleagues demonstrated an association between urinary polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon metabolites and the atopic triad in the United States, such that higher exposure increased atopy. Additionally, in the setting of pollution exposure, the atopic triad was further correlated with increasing age and increasing BMI. Extreme heat plus drought are the perfect ingredients for wildfires, and Colorado is no stranger, with the 3 largest wildfires in the state history occurring in 2020. We have seen a global rise in historic wildfires in recent years, not only in the United States, but across the world, with climate change blamed for the increasing frequency and intensity. These photos illustrate the large amounts of air pollution generated by wildfires, so it's no wonder this really plays a prominent role in exacerbating inflammatory skin conditions, including atopic dermatitis. The quantity of smoke produced by wildfires is so large that it can actually be captured by NASA satellite imagery and spread over vast areas. Particulate matter from California fires spread more than 5,000 miles and affected air quality in Nashville this past summer. Short-term exposure to air pollution from wildfires increases dermatologic clinic visits for atopic dermatitis and pruritus in both pediatric and adult patients. Additionally, a significant association between smoke exposure and the need for systemic medication was observed in adult patients. And interestingly, the majority of adult patients seen for pruritus during the Camp Fire in California did not carry a prior diagnosis of atopic dermatitis, suggesting acute exposure to wildfire smoke may trigger cutaneous atopy. As this chart demonstrates, extreme weather events such as heat waves, extreme precipitation events, and flooding are also increasing in frequency and intensity. And these are photos of flooding from my home state of Tennessee. Patients with atopic dermatitis are already at increased risk of infection, and prolonged exposure to floodwaters further increases the risk of cutaneous infection, including staph, strep, dermatophytes, candida, and atypical organisms. Additionally, floodwaters are often contaminated with sewage, pollution, and chemicals, which may serve as skin irritants. Rapid evacuation and displacement during severe weather events greatly increases stress, which is known to flare eczema. And during these times, medications may be inaccessible or lost, and access to healthcare services can be limited, further exacerbating atopic dermatitis flares. Crowding in shelters can facilitate disease outbreaks, including scabies and transmission of COVID. The role of heat in atopic dermatitis is perhaps more contradictory. Some studies demonstrate a decreased incidence of atopic flares as temperature and humidity increase. However, the combination of heat and air pollution play a synergistic role in increasing atopic dermatitis flares, and heat by itself has been shown to increase eczema-related pruritus. The result of human activity has simply increased CO2, which closely correlates with increasing global temperatures. Consequently, we have seen a shift to more warm weather, which has increased the number of frost-free days that we have observed in the US. Aeroallergens play an important role in atopic diseases because of global warming. The growing season is now lasting longer, and the number of pollen-producing days is increasing, especially at more northern latitudes, as seen on the left. Even more interesting and problematic is that increased atmospheric CO2 levels have a fertilization effect on grasses, ragweed, and other allergen-producing plants, increasing both their pollen production and supercharging their antigenicity, further driving atopic disease exacerbations. I now want to move on and look at the broader forces that are at play here. So just like with disease, climate forces also influence health systems in complex and multifactorial ways and subject the healthcare sector to broad pressures from climate change. Last week, the White House released the National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change. The report found that both climate change threats and global efforts to address it will influence US national security and foreign policy. It identified 11 at-risk nations, which will experience increasing risk of social, economic, and political instability as a result of climate change. And that will manifest as things like new and worsening diseases, including surges in vector-borne illnesses, water insecurity, lower crop yields, extreme weather events, exacerbation of poverty, and political tension. Most nations, interestingly, where Al-Qaeda or ISIS have a presence, are highly vulnerable to climate change. Forced migration and displacement in the face of insecurity is a key issue, and climate-induced population movement into cities is likely to compound the factors of social and political instability. If this seems far-fetched to you, look no further than the Middle East. Human-induced climatic change was a contributory factor in the extreme drought in Syria prior to its civil war. This drought in turn led to large-scale migration. This migration in turn exacerbated the socioeconomic stressors that underpinned Syria's descent into war and cemented the nation as a haven for terrorists. Financial stability is also threatened by climate change. By 2050, the world will experience reduced annual global economic output as a result, and wealthy Western nations' economies will shrink. Insecurity will lead to higher food and water prices. Extreme weather events and depletion of raw materials will increasingly cause disruption of global supply chains. We are seeing extraordinary damage to infrastructure. And in the future, there will be devaluation of real estate prices. It will also become more difficult and expensive to secure insurance. And your ability to borrow money may be reduced. Soaring healthcare costs due to climate change are already at $1 trillion annually in the United States. And given the politically destabilizing effects of climate change discussed on the last slide, what happens to the economy if there is war? 2020 was an extraordinary year for weather and climate events in the US, with the nation enduring an unprecedented 22 separate billion-dollar disasters. We are up to 18 so far this year. A recent study showed that 25% of critical infrastructure in the United States, including hospitals, airports, fire and police stations, power plants, and water treatment facilities, are at risk from failing from floods. We are also dealing with an aging electrical grid. The US has experienced increasing power outages from weather-related events, and outage time has more than doubled in the last 5 years. Consider the social and economic costs of longer and more frequent outages, such as food spoilage, business closures, supply chain disruptions that result. Also, higher summer temperatures and warmer nights increase air conditioning usage, further stressing the electrical grid and inflating our energy bills. Consider how extreme weather events really disrupt access to care for our patients. These are more photos of flooding from Middle Tennessee. There's damage to critical infrastructure, including roads, airports, power grid, and compromised water sanitation. Emergency services are also disrupted when roads are impassable or vehicles are damaged. Take note of the photo here of a fire truck in Nashville underwater. Damage to domiciles result in displacement. Patient medications may be lost or damaged. And patients may have no means of transportation to seek care. All of these factors combine to upend access to medical care. Sometimes healthcare facilities themselves are damaged. Just 8 days before the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic, a tornado destroyed a clinic in Nashville, which provided almost 11,000 medical and dental visits annually to the underserved. The same tornado heavily damaged a Vanderbilt University Medical Center, primary storage and distribution facility that housed most of the medical center's supplies, crippling access to PPE. Earlier this year, Ida caused 4 hospitals to evacuate due to extensive damage. The facilities experienced things like ripped off roofs that you can see in this photo, as well as flooding and loss of power. This left only 1 partially functional hospital to serve a population of 200,000 during a disaster and at a time when the state was experiencing a major COVID surge. A number of hospitals in California have been forced to evacuate large number of patients due to wildfires. St. Helena's had to do so twice. In the pictures on the left, you can see the wildfire encroaching on the facility. And in the lower photo, healthcare personnel are evacuating a patient in a hospital bed as flames literally are whipping in the background. And sadly, the photo on the right is a hospital in Paradise that was destroyed by fire. Not only do the events shown on the last 3 slides deeply affect the ability to provide care to our patients and for patients to access medical care, but I've also paused to think about what would happen to my job and my own livelihood if my healthcare system was struck in a catastrophic way. With the fragility of critical infrastructure in our country and the increasing financial hardships and economic pressures caused by climate change, health systems will be increasingly threatened in the future. Now, a discussion on health effects is not complete without reviewing those who are most vulnerable to climate change. Elderly, young children, pregnant women bear a significant portion of the global health burden due to climate change. And this is largely based on physiology. Those with comorbidities, including cardiovascular disease, pulmonary and renal disease, hypertension, diabetes, and obesity are more susceptible, as are those with spinal cord injuries and intellectual and developmental disabilities. Geography can influence vulnerability, and due to increased exposure to heat and pollution, outdoor workers and athletes have elevated risks. But I really want to stress that the limited access to healthcare and many decades of systemic racism have marginalized minorities and play critical roles in the vulnerability to climate change, disproportionately affecting skin of color, Indigenous peoples, and the poor. Before we move on, I want to take a moment just to reflect on some really important parallels between climate change and COVID. Both really do threaten the health of the global population. The impacts of both were forewarned by scientists and physicians for years, but largely ignored. Both are polarizing and politically divisive. Solutions and public policy. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. So both are really just plagued by science deniers, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. Both place incredible pressure on our healthcare system. The comorbidities that exacerbate morbidity and mortality for both COVID and climate change are identical. Inequalities in vulnerable populations, especially among the impoverished Brown and Black communities and Indigenous peoples, are the same. Climate change has exacerbated COVID. County level mortality rates in the United States have been tied with higher exposure to air pollution. Additionally, COVID surges can be fueled by extreme weather events, resulting in massive evacuations and crowding in shelters, facilitating the transmission of COVID. Both pose a massive global economic burden with rippling effects. And both COVID and climate change require global cooperation to mitigate the burden to health. So now I want to do a deep dive on this topic to unpack environmental racism and hopefully enhance your understanding of how critical this topic is to the vulnerability of marginalized communities. In fact, climate change, environmental justice, and disparities are so intertwined. I don't think you can have a legitimate conversation about climate change without including these in the discussion. Throughout this talk, I have referred to the multifactorial and complex nature of interactions which climate change imposes on human health and the healthcare sector itself. These disparities that climate change exacerbates are no exception. They are equally susceptible to those multifactorial influences. Because of global warming, we have shifted to more hot weather, with the number of danger days expected to rise dramatically in the coming decades. Understanding the effects of heat are really foundational to a discussion on environmental injustice. Heat waves are increasing in frequency and severity and can have deadly consequences. The skin plays a critical role in thermoregulation, dissipating heat via vasodilation, and the production and evaporation of sweat from the skin's surface. During episodes of heat stress, as much as 60% of cardiac output is shunted to dilated vessels in the skin. On the right, you can see the severity in symptoms as the physiological response to heat stress progresses from exhaustion to stroke. And because of the acute cardiovascular stress associated with extreme heat, elderly patients and those with comorbidities are most susceptible. However, children and those with spinal cord injuries can also be particularly vulnerable. Additionally, a large number of medications are known to alter the physiological response to heat. Heat is the most concerning of all extreme weather events, as it represents the top weather killer not only globally, but also in our country. And 1/3 of the world's population is exposed to deadly heat for numerous days annually. And while this picture may be mistaken for a temporary COVID morgue, this was actually in Asia following a deadly heat wave. Chronic exposure to heat has numerous long-term detrimental effects. Worse, ambient temperatures are remaining higher at night, reducing the body's ability to cool and recover before being exposed again. Heat exacerbates cardiovascular and lung disease, renal disease, diabetes, and mental health conditions. Chronic heat exposure is implicated in low birth weights and preterm delivery and reduces cognition in school-aged children. It also reduces worker productivity. Urban heat islands are significantly warmer pockets within cities and are a result of increased concrete and fewer plants and trees, meaning more heat is absorbed and retained, less water is absorbed, and there is less natural cooling via plant transpiration and evaporation. Urbanization and climate change appear to be combining to increase summer heat within cities compared to nearby rural areas. So of the top 10 cities with the most intense summer heat islands, 2 in the list are in the Rocky Mountain region, Denver and Albuquerque. And so I've juxtaposed these with my hometown of Nashville. But actually all 3 cities show significantly increased summer heat averages and the potential for double-digit differences in comparison to nearby rural areas. Additionally, the number of days over 90 degrees is markedly higher than rural areas. And notably, the urban heat island effect is persisting at night within these cities. So in the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, a government-sponsored corporation was created called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Its purpose was to refinance home mortgages currently in default to prevent foreclosure. And to assess credit worthiness for refinancing, Holk created residential security maps that were color-coded by race. This became known as redlining because the majority of Black neighborhoods were marked in red and designated as hazardous. This thinly veiled segregationist practice to keep Blacks in poorer, resource-deficient neighborhoods in effect legalized racist real estate practices and diminished Black wealth. Unfortunately, the effects of redlining endure today, as the majority of these redlined neighborhoods are currently of low or moderate income and remain minoritized. So what does this type of institutional racism have to do with climate change? Jeremy Hoffman examined the correlation between redlining and urban heat islands and found that for the majority of US cities, the redlined areas were now the hottest parts of those cities. Based on this study, formerly redlined areas in Nashville are now urban heat islands with temperatures 8.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the green areas on the map that were deemed most favorable. Those favorable areas remain wealthy and white today, while the urban heat islands are poorer neighborhoods and communities of color. The story is the same for Denver. Redlined neighborhoods are now a whopping 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than those marked favorable in the 1930s. And to orient you and to make a later point, for those of you tuning in from Denver, the red arrow at the top of the slide is pointing to Globeville, and which you will see that neighborhood was also redlined. So the CDC has a very interesting tool for tracking heat and vulnerability at the county level that provides a more granular depiction. So this map is for Metro Nashville and Davidson County, and those are outlined in red there on the map. And vulnerability is defined here as minority race, poverty, lack of insurance, and limited English. And the prevalence of these factors is quantified in each county and in each neighborhood. And based on the demographics of those neighborhoods, they are rated as having low to high vulnerability to heat. Not surprisingly, many of the formerly redlined areas in Nashville have the highest heat vulnerability now. Now let's look at the same assessment for Denver County and the surrounding areas. The marker on the map denotes Globeville, which was redlined in the 1930s. Today, this community, Globeville, is 2/3 Hispanic, is ranked high on the heat vulnerability index, and only has about half the park space of the average Denver neighborhood. Additionally, the I-25, I-70 exchange runs through this community, exposing residents to large amounts of traffic-related air pollution. Black and Hispanic race and lower socioeconomic status were most closely associated with the location of hazardous waste facilities in the US in a 1987 study. Unfortunately, not much has changed. Superfund sites are more often located in areas disproportionately populated by communities of color and those with low income, and proximity is associated with an increased cancer risk. Moreover, these sites are contaminated by extremely hazardous chemicals and the increasing frequency and intensity of severe weather events and sea level rise are making these sites incredibly prone to flooding, as shown in the photo here. Black Americans are more likely to live close to natural gas facilities. And infant mortality rates during California heat waves were the highest for Black babies. With respect to air pollution, it's disproportionately generated by whites. So this is the diagram here at the bottom. And despite the fact that Black and brown people contribute less to the overall problem of air pollution, they are more affected by it. This creates a pollution advantage for whites, meaning they breathe about 17% less air pollution than they generate, leaving Hispanics and Blacks with a pollution burden, whereby they breathe approximately 60% more pollution than they actually caused. In summary, in the US, low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are often geographically near highways, with increased exposure to high levels of air pollution. They're often near industrial areas and toxic waste sites, and these neighborhoods have fewer trees and more concrete. Consequently, these neighborhoods are disproportionately affected by heat and pollution. Moreover, residents in these neighborhoods may lack air conditioning and often pay higher energy bills from inefficient weatherization of their homes and lack of access to renewable or affordable energy. On top of experiencing greater health effects as a result of these environmental exposures, low-income individuals and communities of color have less access to quality healthcare and higher rates of comorbidities in general, including obesity, diabetes, hypertension, renal disease, cardiovascular disease, when compared to whites. Similarly, the most vulnerable are the ones who experience the effects of climate change first, which explains why COVID-19 hit communities of color harder than any other population in our country. And really, the pandemic has underscored the impact of the climate gap in minoritized and poor communities. As the diagram illustrates, the pressures applied by climate change amplify multidimensional disparities, enhance vulnerabilities, and accentuate the impacts, thus perpetuating the vicious cycle of disparity and inequity. Inequity for climate risks extends well beyond the US. The wealthiest 10% of the global population are responsible for producing a whopping 50% of global carbon emissions, as seen in this diagram. Climate change affects the poorest nations and the poorest people who have increased exposure, increased vulnerability, less economic resources for resiliency and adaptation, and are those who have contributed the least to greenhouse gas accumulation. In the poorest economies, there is a disproportionate dependence on sectors that may be most affected by climate change, like agriculture and forestry and fisheries. Consequently, the World Bank estimates tens of millions of people will be pushed into poverty due to climate change by 2030, and that climate change is predicted to displace anywhere from 250 million to 1 billion people by 2050. These disparities have created a divide between the global north and the global south, where the gap between the economic output of the world's richest and poorest countries is 25% larger today than it would have been without global warming. So I want to switch gears, and this is the last part of my talk. And I want to take a few minutes here to examine the evidence for the health effects due to climate change and discuss what I think our priorities should be. So I copied this from the Cochrane website, and it reminded me that the entire aim of this group is to compile high quality evidence about health and healthcare. And that got me thinking about the evidence supporting climate change and skin disease. So there is now pretty much unanimous scientific consensus that human activities are driving global climate change. That then prompted me to question if there is scientific consensus on the health effects and what the level of evidence is in the literature for those effects. So according to international intergovernmental agencies, the answer is yes, there is consensus on the harm to human health caused by climate change. Specifically, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Paris Climate Accord both call for drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we hope to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These reductions are necessary to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and to mitigate effects on human health. The UN, the World Health Organization, the Lancet Countdown, the CDC, and others all agree that the health impacts from warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius will be devastating. The second question I asked myself was, what is the level of evidence for such harm in the literature? And so to begin to answer that question, I decided to do some really quick and dirty lit searches. This wasn't meant to be a deep dive or a rigorous examination of the literature, but rather just a snapshot to see where we are. And a general PubMed search of climate change and health revealed over 12,000 results, but only 180 systematic reviews and a handful of meta-analyses, clinical trials, and randomized controlled trials. With respect to the randomized controlled trials, most weren't even relevant to climate change when I did the search. And not surprisingly, the sheer volume of articles on this topic has dramatically increased in recent history. When I looked more specifically at climate change in dermatology, there are far fewer results and very limited numbers of randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and systematic reviews. So I thought this would be a great group with whom to have a conversation about how further work is needed to more fully understand the impact of climate change on health and health systems in general, and dermatologic conditions specifically. It's important to identify the information gaps, set research priorities, and foster impactful research in this area. In my own thinking about this, I realized there are really important limitations and obstacles here. Many of the questions are epidemiologic and require assessing the relationship of exposure with a disease or outcome. Establishing harm is best suited to studies that provide, unfortunately, lower levels of evidence, such as observational and animal studies. Because almost all of us are exposed to climate change in some way, and are affected by it in some way, I was thinking about how to best identify non-exposed groups in cohort studies, and also thinking that quantifying an individual's exposure to climate change variables could be very challenging. In designing studies, we must also consider acute health effects, as well as long-term effects, which may have a lengthy latency period. The risks of climate change result from the interaction of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. These are multifactorial problems with complex interactions involving multiple and cumulative environmental impacts, and they vary based on context, such as demographics, socioeconomics, geography, urbanization, economic growth, and policy. Climate models are complex and they have varying methodology, so they provide a range of projections over specific temporal or spatial scales. There's really inherent uncertainty in modeling the future and the magnitude, partly because it will depend on what we do to mitigate it now. And so despite all these limitations, I do really think there's tremendous opportunity to design meaningful studies on the dermatologic effects of climate change, as well as looking at and studying the benefits of climate change interventions. Work already done on air pollution and atopic dermatitis are great examples. In dermatology specifically, we need more observational studies that clearly define the cutaneous harm caused by climate change. We also must leverage technology to create innovative solutions and interventions, and then design high quality randomized controlled trials that look at the validity of those interventions for mitigating climate change related dermatologic disease. Another way to conceptualize this is the exposome. Exposome means the totality of exposures to which an individual is subjected in their lifetime and how those exposures relate to health. Studying the exposome examines how our environment, diet, lifestyle interact with our own unique characteristics, such as genetics and physiology and epigenetic impacts. The concept is really a crucial link between epidemiology, immunology, and cell biology with respect to the etiology and pathogenesis of specific diseases. And because skin is our primary interface with our environment, it's a prime target for exploration of exposomal influences on disease. One could argue that since genetics accounts for only about 10% of human disease, environmental exposure should be more heavily weighted when we examine disease pathogenesis. And exploration of the exposome is a novel way to understand the magnitude of climate impacts on health and individual disease. So where do we need to go? We're at a crossroads. According to the IPCC, we must either drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we hope to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or really suffer detrimental health consequences. And it's clear that that is necessary, these emission reductions, to mitigate and reduce the worst impacts. Adam Rogers wrote in Wired magazine, "Fixing the effects of climate change on Earth isn't complicated. When you get down to it, all we humans need to save the world is ingenuity, grit, cooperation, and $53 trillion. Yeah, I wish it were that simple. The magnitude and complexity of global climate change affects every human and every nation, crossing multiple scales, disciplines, systems, and societal levels. Mitigation and adaptation will require a multidisciplinary approach to preserve and improve human health for everyone. Healthcare cannot operate in a silo. We must engage key stakeholders and collaborate with other sectors to develop innovative cross-cutting solutions. We need buy-in from the private sector and financial markets. And funding a climate and health research agenda must be prioritized, and our research, advocacy, and policies must include the impact of climate change on social determinants of health and support resiliency and social justice in vulnerable and marginalized populations. I want to plug our Cochrane Climate and Health Working Group and acknowledge our tireless, fearless leader, Denise Thompson, who's just really done tremendous work in organizing us and spearheading a number of projects. So we are an international collaboration of people who are concerned about the climate crisis and are committed to applying the tools of evidence synthesis and knowledge translation to supporting decision makers. And so we have a few current projects in the works, including an editorial. There are folks working on the development and validation of a climate and health search filter. Because remember, when I looked at those 12,000 articles, many actually weren't even relevant. So I think this will be really key to helping us in synthesizing this particular topic. And then there's also a scoping review in the works that is trying to answer the question of what is known about the context, constraints, and enablers that influence the development and implementation of climate health adaptation policy by national and subnational governments. And then we have a new project that is newly underway, examining the impact of climate change on the global burden of disease. Global burden of infectious disease. So that's exciting. The group is just now organizing. So if anyone is interested in participating in this group, I would encourage you to visit the website, and Denise's email is there. And I think we have really exciting work that we are doing here. And so in closing, I want to highlight the complexity of interactions and repercussions between human activity, climate change, and the impacts on health and health sectors, especially for vulnerable populations and marginalized groups who have been victimized by systemic racism. It's all connected and interwoven. Consequently, human consumption of resources and burning fossil fuels have led to a dangerous degree of climate change that is now becoming self-sustaining due to its own feedback mechanisms, which further amplify and accelerate the environmental impacts. Because the human population has doubled in the last 50 years, the critical pressures of climate change act as force multipliers, increasingly magnifying the impact of those pressures. We are at a crucial crossroads. Our next move will be enormously consequential, leading many to consider climate change to be the existential crisis of our century. I want to end by positing that we as physicians and scientists have an obligation to make this a research priority and a moral imperative to advocate for drastic changes to mitigate human health effects and protect those most vulnerable, both locally and globally. So thank you so much for your time and attention. My email is listed here. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to start a dialogue, and I'd be happy, Bob, if we, and Lucas, if we have time to open the floor to any questions. I know we got a little bit of a late start.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for being with us today and for tackling such a big topic on our telecast here. I apologize for the hacking, which delayed the start of your talk. So I don't want to let anybody think that you're going over time here is a result of your wanting to talk more than an hour. even despite the importance of the problem. How would you like to handle questions? I know we have one question from Professor Morton Mower in the chat. Would you like to read that out and address it? I think one of the questions that came up to some of us was, how much is the US contributing to global emissions right now compared to other countries? And how can we as an individual country influence other countries?
So we are among the top 5 globally. And I think it's important to know that the healthcare sector in the United States is a huge offender if we want to look in the mirror at ourselves. So when you look at global healthcare sector emissions, it accounts for about 4.6% of greenhouse gas emissions and roughly the same in non-greenhouse gas air pollution. Of those emissions, the United States alone, the healthcare sector in the United States alone contributes 25% of that. And here at home, it's a greater fraction of the overall greenhouse gases. So in the US, where globally it's 4.6%, here in the US, the healthcare sector contributes 10% to US emissions and another 9% to non-greenhouse gas air pollution and emissions. And so, we're offenders in both our own sector, but our own nation. I think there is a lot that can be done, and that's another entire hour-long talk. I think, if you haven't read the New England Journal of Medicine commentary that came out recently on the call to decarbonize the US healthcare sector, I think it's an interesting read and is certainly excellent food for thought. And then
we have some questions from Lily Luo. How do you feel about using nuclear energy to drastically reduce our carbon emission? And then there's some follow-up questions.
Yeah, so, I think that's a double-edged sword to talk about nuclear energy. It has its benefits and it has its problems. I think things like renewable energy, like sun and wind, are really much more viable. And prior to now, the cost was really prohibitive, but renewable energy sources have drastically come down in price and are comparable now in many regions, including the US, with the cost of burning fossil fuels.
She had a follow-on question on how nuclear energy might affect minority populations in neighborhoods. Would be.
I'm not sure. I've never looked at mapping the location of nuclear energy sites and where those are located. If it tracks with Superfund sites and factories and industries, then it probably is located in more minoritized neighborhoods. And of course, we all, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us are familiar with, and some of you remember the Long Island nuclear reactor disaster. And of course, there's others globally like Chernobyl and damage to nuclear reactors in Japan from extreme weather events. So they aren't without their problems. So I'd love to get back though to maybe some other specific health related topics.
Okay, we have Paul McCann is asking, you mentioned urinary metabolites. Would you, what are the recommended biomarkers for exposures to pollutants?
So are you talking about which specific metabolites of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons were examined in that study? I would have to pull it to give you that specific information. But the point is that many of the air pollutants are lipophilic, and so they are stored in fat and then re-released into the body and are measurable in things like the urine. But that study relative to atopic triad was looking specifically at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Benzoaprine is one of the most common ones studied with respect to skin.
And then Dr. Parker, I had a question. You did a search of the dermatology literature for climate trials. And I think we've had Denise Thompson talk in our series. So we've enjoyed her. And we've also had environmental scientists talk about the increasing importance of systematic reviews in environmental sciences. So I think you're a great segue to those talks here today. How many randomized control trials did you find?
Not many, just
Yeah.
I think it was like 2 or 3.
Yeah, I was wondering if what those 2 or 3 were. Would you be able to comment?
I actually don't remember, Bob, what they were, but I can get that information.
Yeah, great. And
Actually, you know what, Bob, there might have been 0 randomized control trials. I can pull the slide again. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Screen? Yeah, let me
Pull the
do
slide.
that.
You went over that pretty quickly. So as a dermatologist, I'm curious about
Yes, of course.
what they were.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to scroll down and see if I can find it here quickly. Okay. Okay, so there were only 2 relevant randomized control trials. I don't remember exactly what they were. I think one was air pollution and atopic dermatitis, and I don't remember the other one, but I can pull that for you, Bob.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, I was thinking about natural experiments that, you know, recent economists have won Nobel Prizes over, and how those might be an alternative to randomized control trials. I mean, we're going to have areas that are exposed to wildfire smoke and areas that aren't, and seeing how those areas change in their health patterns during those periods will be a natural experiment that we can unfortunately look to in the future. We are over time now. We're about 15 minutes over time. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. Dr. Parker, I want to again thank you for the high quality talk you've given us here today, and how you've expanded our thoughts in so many different important realms here today. And we have a request for you to put your contact slide up again, if you would.
Oh, okay.
If you're willing.
Sure, yes. Yes, of course. It's a publicly available email address.
Terrific.
To hear from anybody if there are additional questions, since we got hijacked and delayed today. If there are additional, please by all means email me. I'd love to converse about these things. If there's interest in collaboration on topics, I would love that as well. And then you can get Denise Thompson's email from the Cochrane Climate and Health Working Group website. And feel free to reach out to her if you have a broader interest in joining that group.
Thanks so much, Dr. Parker.
I'll just add thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
And sense of humor through our disruption earlier. That was a first for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, like I said, I'm not sure whether to be offended or flattered.
Right?
I think
we're
it's
sort of like when celebrities have negative publicity. They say there's no such thing as bad, as bad press. So I guess I'm flattered that somebody took time out of their day to try to hack us. So
all right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.